Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History. So, I covered Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. Leaving the final area in Europe that I need to cover is Central Europe. The interesting thing about this era is that it constantly changes compared to the others, and I don't think it's as talked about. But before we get into anything else, we need to define what Central Europe is. As a geographic region, Central Europe sits between the Atlantic-oriented west, the Eurasian east, the Mediterranean south, and the Baltic/Nordic north, where the major natural zones in it are the Alps, the northern European plain, the Danube basin, the Carpathians, and the Bohemian uplands, making the region a crossroads, a migration corridor, a battlefield, and a trade nexus where people passed through Central Europe first in their destinations over the last 2,000 years and more. Regarding it being a historical civilization zone, Central Europe is less about ethnicity and more about, historically, Latin Christianity, the Holy Roman Sphere, Habsburg influence, the urban Guild culture, Catholic Protestant conflict, and frontier politics, where the key historical anchors include the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which makes sense based on its location, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which also makes sense, Prussia, and the Habsburg monarchy, where historically Central Europe functioned as the middle zone between Germanic Europe, Slavic Europe, and the Balkans, hence the region being so mixed linguistically and culturally. Regarding the ethnic and linguistic complexity, Central Europe contains overlapping populations from multiple major European ethno-linguistic families. So there are the Germanic peoples, which consist of the Austrians, many Germans, and Swiss Germans, the West Slavs, which includes the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Uralic peoples, which includes the Hungarians/Magyars, the South Slavic overlap, which includes the Slovenes and the Croats, where historically nearly every Central European state contained in minority populations Jews, Roma, Germans outside of Germany, Slavs outside Slavic majority areas, Hungarians outside of Hungary, Armenians, Italians, Ruthenians, and Ukrainians, producing a region where multilingualism was common, borders were rarely matched by ethnicity, and the identity was layered. When it comes to the Central European identity, many people here historically felt not fully Western, not fully Eastern, distinct from Russia, and distinct from the Mediterranean world. Especially during the Cold War, intellectuals in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia often argued we are culturally Central/West Europeans trapped politically in Eastern Europe. This became a major intellectual idea after World War II and the Soviet domination, where it was argued that Central Europe was a kidnapped West. When it comes to religion and civilization, religion deeply shaped the region where historically Catholicism dominated Austria, Poland, Hungary, Croatia, and Slovenia. Protestantism became strong in Germany and the Czech lands. Judaism was historically major in many cities. Orthodoxy appeared on southern or southeastern frontiers, my bad. Islam appeared through the Ottoman influence in the Balkans and Hungary. Central Europe became one of Europe's major zones of religious conflict, coexistence, and syncretism, where the architecture reflects this, i.e., the Gothic, Baroque, Renaissance, Jewish urban traditions, and Ottoman traces, often existing within the same city in Central Europe. From an anthropological lens, Central Europe has historically been viewed as a transition zone, where older European anthropology from the 19th to early 20th century tried to classify Europeans into racial types, including Alpine, Nordic, Dinaric, East Baltic, Mediterranean. Central Europe was often described as a mixed zone containing combinations of Alpine populations, Nordic influences, Slavic Eastern influences, Dinaric Southeastern influences, and modern anthropology just ignores and rejects these rigid racial typologies overall. However, the historical classifications mattered because they shaped nationalism, eugenics, immigration policy, Nazi racial ideology, and the ideas of European hierarchy. So now to talk about Central Europe and race. Central Europeans were often viewed differently depending on the area that they were in, where in older Western European and American racial thinking, Germans and Austrians were often treated as highly white or core European, while the Poles, Hungarians, the Slavs, and Balkan adjacent groups were sometimes treated as less fully Western or less desirable, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where Slavs were often racialized in Western Europe and the US, and the Eastern/Central Europeans were often stereotyped as peasant, backward, authoritarian, hyper-ethnic, and insufficiently Anglo-Saxon. Over time, especially in the diaspora, they gradually became absorbed into the broader white category over time. And then another element to this is the relationship between Jewish people and Central Europe, where Central Europe was one of the historical centers of Ashkenazi Jewish civilization. Major Jewish populations existed in Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Krakow, Lviv, and Bratislava. Hopefully, I did not mispronounce those names. Jewish culture heavily influenced the philosophy, psychoanalysis, music, literature, science, finance, and urban life, where important Central European Jewish figures include Sigmund Freud, Franz Kafka, and Gustav Mahler. Essentially, the Cold War changed the meaning of Central Europe, where after World War II, much of Central Europe fell under Soviet influence. The term Eastern Europe became politically expanded. So this next section is going to be about why are they and their descendants are grouped together today. So one of the reasons is geography forced historical interaction. So because Central Europe is in the middle of the European continent, the peoples there traded together, fought together, intermarried, migrated across borders, and lived under shared empires for centuries as the region became kind of a shared historical ecosystem. Even groups with different languages often shared similar food, architecture, political systems, dress, urban culture, military service, educational systems, and etc. So another reason is that empires unified the region. The biggest reason Central Europeans became grouped together is empire. So examples include the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as these states ruled over mixed populations for generations, creating administrative integration, cultural overlap, elite interactions, and shared institutions. So the Habsburg especially would connect and link together Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes, Poles, Jews, and Romanians. Another reason is that they were positioned between quote unquote West and quote unquote East, where Central Europeans became grouped together because the outsiders increasingly saw them as neither fully Western European nor fully Eastern European, and they occupied a middle zone between Germanic/Atlantic Europe and Russia/Eastern Europe, as well as the Balkans. Nationalism also simplified regional complexity. So, before modern nationalism, identities were more layered. A person could be ethnically Czech, German speaking, loyal to the Habsburg Emperor, Catholic, and culturally Viennese all at once. But the 19th century nationalism pushed people into clear ethnic categories like Pole, Hungarian, German, Slovak, and Czech. Immigration also made them look more similar abroad. So this is more diasporic. And this became important, especially in the United States, Canada, and Latin America. So when Central Europeans immigrated abroad, local societies often collapsed distinctions between them. So, Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes, and Czechs might be labeled Eastern European, Slavic, Continental European, or immigrant stock in these diasporic countries, where over generations intermarriage increased, English, French, and Spanish replaced their heritage language, and ethnic boundaries softened. Another major reason why they're grouped together today is that race in the Americas collapsed European differences, where in Europe, Central Europeans historically had many internal distinctions and hierarchies. where in the diasporic regions, they are all gradually absorbed into the broader category of white Europeans, as the older distinctions became less important over time. And by the mid 20th century, many Central European descendants grouped in North America were viewed similarly within the white mainstream. A huge reason is that the Cold War reinforced the grouping. So during the Cold War, much of Central Europe was politically grouped into quote unquote Eastern Europe. This happened because Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany fell into the Soviet sphere, where Western media and politics often flattened regional differences. So internally or internationally, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Slavic Europe all became blurred together. After 1989, many countries pushed back against this label and reasserted, we are Central European, not Russian East. Due to this, it also led to shared historical trauma, also unifying the region, where Central Europeans shared several major historical experiences like the imperial collapse, World War I, border changes, ethnic conflict, fascism, Nazism, the Holocaust, Soviet domination, communism, and the post 1989 transition. These shared experiences created a recognizable regional historical memory that other areas just don't have. Their descendants often inherited compressed identities, so by the third or fourth generation abroad in the diaspora, descendants often no longer maintain exact village identity, the dialect, and the regional distinctions. Instead, identities compress into Polish, Hungarian, Czech, Balkan, Eastern European, Slavic, and Central European, or simply European ancestry. This is very common in settler societies. Anthropologically, they were seen as related populations, where older anthropology also contributed to the grouping. 19th and 20th century racial theorists often categorize Central Europeans as overlapping quote unquote European stocks such as Alpine, Slavic, Nordic and mixed, Dinaric, and East Baltic. Though modern anthropology rejects rigid racial typologies, these classifications influenced census categories, immigration laws, popular stereotypes, ideas of European similarity, and over time, Central Europeans became folded into the larger social idea of continental white European. And the final reason is that the modern grouping is partly political and cultural. So today, Central Europe survives because the region still shares intertwined history, architectural continuity, similar political trajectories, overlapping cuisines, Catholic and Protestant heritage, post communist transitions, and the EU integration experiences. So here is the timeline of what is now known as Central Europeans. So prehistoric Central Europe. So this is before 500 BCE. So, before the modern ethnic group or modern ethnic groups in general existed, Central Europe was inhabited by layers of prehistoric populations, which included early Indo European migrants, farming expansion from Anatolia, Bronze Age trade systems, and Celtic cultural emergence. Important architectural cultures like linear pottery, corded ware, Urnfield, and Hallstatt were formed. At this stage, identities were tribal, languages constantly shifted, and the populations mixed. Now we're moving on to Celtic Central Europe. So this is from 800 BCE to 100 BCE. So before the Slavs and Hungarians arrived, much of Central Europe was heavily Celtic, which included an occupied part of Austria, southern Germany, Czechland, Hungary, and Switzerland. The Latin culture spread across the region, and the Celts established trade networks, fortified settlements, and ironworking systems. So 100 BCE to 500 CE is seen as the Roman and Germanic era, where the southern edge of Central Europe came under the Roman Empire, which reached Austria, southern Germany, and parts of Hungary. Meanwhile, Germanic tribes expanded across Central Europe, i.e., the Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Suebi, and Marcomanni. The region became a frontier between Roman civilization and tribal northern Europe. Then came the migration period. So from roughly 300 to 600 CE, the Huns moved westward, Germanic tribes migrated, Roman authority collapsed, population shifted dramatically. Now we're at the Slavic expansion, which is from 500 to 900 CE. So after the migration period, Slavic people spread into much of Central Europe, where West Slavs became dominant in Poland, Czechia, and Slovakia, while South Slavs expanded towards the Balkans. This period saw the rise of the Great Moravia, early Polish states, and Bohemian principles or principalities. Now we're moving on to the Magyar arrival in medieval Central Europe, which is from 800 to 1300. So around the late 9th century, the Magyars entered the Carpathian Basin and formed what became Hungary, which permanently changed Central Europe's ethnic landscape. At the same time, the Holy Roman Empire dominated German-speaking Central Europe. Poland consolidated, Bohemia rose in importance, and Christianity spread throughout the region. By the High Middle Ages, Central Europe had become urbanizing, feudal, Christianized, and interconnected, where the German settlers also moved eastward in a process called Umsiedlung. Apologies for that mispronunciation, which I'm sure was a mispronunciation. Anyways, this spread German speaking populations into Bohemia, Silesia, Hungary, and the Baltics. Now we're on to the late medieval and Renaissance Central Europe, so from 1300 to 1600. This era saw growing cities, universities, trade expansion, stronger monarchies, the Habsburg dynasty becoming increasingly dominant. Meanwhile, Central Europe faced the Ottoman expansion, religious upheaval, dynastic conflict. The Ottoman Empire pushed deep into Hungary after the Battle of Max. Hungary became divided between the Ottoman rule, the Habsburg rule, and the semi-independent territories. So, from 1500 to 1700 is called the Reformation and the religious conflict, or that's the main theme of this area when it comes, or this era when it comes to Central Europe. So, Central Europe became one of Europe's major religious battlegrounds, where the Protestant Reformation spread widely through the German lands, Bohemia, and parts of Hungary. The region was devastated by the 30 Years' War. This conflict depopulated regions, hardened confessional divisions, strengthened Habsburg power. By the late 1600s, Austria emerged stronger, Prussia became rising, and Poland weakened politically. Next is the Enlightenment and Imperial Central Europe. So this is from 1700 to 1815. So Central Europe became dominated by large empires, i.e., the Habsburg, Austria, Prussia, and Russia in Poland's east. The partitions of Poland erased Poland from the map for over a century. Yikes. The region modernized through bureaucracy, military reform, enlightenment ideas, and centralized governance. From 1815 to 1914, nationalism and industrialization take place, and this is one of the most transformative periods. Industrialization accelerated in Germany, Austria, and Bohemia, while nationalism exploded amongst the Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and Germans. The Austro-Hungarian Empire became one of the most ethnically complex states in the world. Meanwhile, anti-Semitism intensified, mass migration increased, modern political ideologies emerged, with millions of Central Europeans emigrated to the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Brazil. From 1914 to 1918, World War I and its imperial collapsed. So World War I shattered the old Central European order. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. The German Empire transformed. New nation-states emerged. New countries included Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and restored Poland. But borders rarely matched the ethnic realities, which created future tensions. So, from 1918 to 1945, this is where the interwar crisis and what would eventually lead up to World War II taking place. Central Europe experienced economic instability, authoritarianism, ethnic conflict, fascism, and Nazism. The Holocaust devastated Central European Jewish civilization. Millions died, i.e., Jews, Roma, Slavs, civilians, and soldiers. World War II also led to the mass expulsions of ethnic Germans, border shifts, and enormous demographic transformations. The old multicultural Central Europe was permanently altered. Now we are moving on to the Communist Central Europe, which is from 1945 to 1989. After World War II, much of Central Europe fell into Soviet control and the Soviet sphere. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany became communist states. Internationally, they are often labeled Eastern European, despite strong Central European identities amongst themselves. This period saw industrialization, authoritarian governments, censorship, uprising, and Soviet intervention. Important moments included the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, the Prague Spring, and solidarity in Poland. Now we're moving on to the post-communist Central Europe, which is from 1989 to 2004. So the collapse of communism transformed the region yet again. Central European states moved towards democracy, capitalism, NATO, and the European Union. Many strongly reasserted, "We are Central European, not the Soviet East." This era included privatization, economic upheaval, Western integration, and identity reconstruction. And now we're in modern Central Europe, so essentially from 2004 to the present day. Today, Central Europe is urbanized, economically integrated into Europe, politically diverse, historically self conscious. This region still balances nationalism, EU integration, historical memory, demographic change, East and West positioning. Modern Central Europeans inherit layers from Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Jewish, Magyar, Habsburg, Soviet, and European Union histories all simultaneously. Now it is time to talk about the average phenotype of Central Europeans. And before we even get there, I want to state that there is no single Central European phenotype because Central Europe has historically been one of Europe's most mixed transition zones. But there are broad regional tendencies that tend to overlap. So let's just get to it. So, first, I want to address why Central Europeans vary so much. Central Europe sits at the meeting point of Germanic Europe, Slavic Europe, Balkan Europe, Baltic Europe, historically Jewish Central Europe, and steppe influences from the East. Over the centuries, the region experienced migration, intermarriage, imperial mixing, border shifts, population replacement, so there's no clean, uniform look. So, onto the broad average Central European look. Broadly speaking, the average Central European tends to fall within light to medium skin tones, brown hair is the most common, dark blonde hair also common, blue, gray, green, and hazel eyes frequent, medium facial structure and moderate height, variable skull slash facial shapes depending on the sub region. Statistically, the most common amongst Central Europe is probably light skin, brown hair, and mixed slash light eyes. So there is some regional variation across Central Europe. So on northern Central Europe, so this is Poland and northern Germany, they tend to lean towards lighter pigmentation, more blonde slash light brown hair, lighter eyes, and somewhat more northern slash Eastern European overlap, which reflects strong historical ties and overlaps with the Baltic populations, the Germanic Northern Europe, and West Slavic populations. Regarding the southern slash central Danubian zone, this is in reference to Austria, Hungary, Slovenia, and Croatia. That tends to lean towards darker brown hair being more common, mixed eye colors, and somewhat more southeastern influence, with stronger alpine slash Dinaric overlap. Features are often appearing to be slightly more Mediterranean slash Balkan adjacent than northern Central Europe. And then we have Czech slash Slovak transitional zone. So this often appears intermediate between the Germanic northwest, the Slavic east, and the Alpine south. This region is one of the clearest Middle Europe transition populations. Now we are at the final portion of the video, and this is where I like to talk about whiteness and the area that I'm talking about's hierarchy or relationship within the hierarchy of whiteness. So pretty much I'm going to break down Central Europeans in their hierarchy of whiteness. So the main thing I want, or the first thing I want to discuss, is the hierarchy of whiteness was mostly just an Anglo-American system, where this became especially important in the United States, Canada, Britain, and Australia in the late 19th to early 20th century, where many elites came from this area, and at the top were usually Anglo-Saxons, Nordics, and Northwestern Europeans, where these groups were often associated with Protestantism, wealth, empire, industrial power, and civilization superiority, quote unquote, in older racial thinking. Central Europeans were often seen as less ideal whites. Many Central Europeans were viewed as ethnically white but culturally or socially suspect. This was especially pushed towards the Poles, Hungarians, Slavs, Jews, Slovaks, Croats, Southern Germans, and Balkan adjacent groups, as they are stereotyped as poor, rural, overtly Catholic or Jewish, politically radical, clannish, foreign, insufficiently Anglo Saxon. So they often occupied a middle category of whites, but not fully old stock whites. Germans and Austrians were usually ranked higher compared to other Central Europeans, as they are considered closer to the core European status. This was because they are associated with education, industrialization, classic culture, Protestantism in some cases, science, and imperial prestige, where Germany especially became identified with high European civilization in the 19th century. So, German speaking Central Europeans often ranked higher within the white hierarchies than Slavic immigrants. Now we're going to move on to the Slavs, where they are frequently racialized and faced harsher treatment. In older Western racial thinking, Poles, Slovaks, and some Croats and other Slavic peoples were portrayed as backward, emotional, authoritarian, primitive, less intelligent, and too Eastern. This is not always formal, legal, not whiteness, but rather conditional or lower status whites. So, in the US, Poles and other Slavs were often discriminated against socially and economically in the early 20th century. So, Jewish people who were in Central Europe or descendants of Central Europe occupied a uniquely unstable racial position as they were European and often visually indistinguishable from surrounding populations. Yet, anti Semitic systems frequently treated as or caused them to be treated as racially alien, Semitic, Asiatic, and biologically separate. This reached its extreme under the Holocaust, and I don't feel like I need to say anything else. The element of religion, especially Catholicism, also affected this hierarchy, where many Central Europeans were Catholic, Orthodox, adjacent, and Jewish in societies dominated by Protestant Anglo elites, as Catholics were often stereotyped as authoritarian, superstitious, tribal, and less democratic in comparison. So even physically light-skinned Central Europeans could still be viewed as culturally inferior. So things changed with industrialization and upward mobility. So by the mid 20th century, many Central European descendant groups moved into the suburbs, gained education, intermarried, and entered mainstream institutions. This gradually dissolved many older ethnic distinctions. Groups once seen as ethnic whites, new immigrants, and foreign Europeans became absorbed into mainstream white identity. This happened to the Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, Croats, many Jewish people, and other Central and Eastern Europeans, especially after World War II. The Nazi era temporarily reordered European whiteness, where obviously they put it in a way where the Germans and Nordics were ranked the highest. Some Central Europeans could be able to partially assimilate. Slavs were often considered inferior, and Jews and Roma were excluded entirely. However, the Nazi ideology was inconsistent and politically opportunistic, as it was also dependent on alliance strategy and racial interpretation. Today, most Central Europeans are fully folded into white Europe, as Central Europeans are broadly considered white Europeans without major qualification. The older internal European hierarchy has weakened substantially and significantly. However, traces of it still exists. Culturally, as stereotypes about Eastern Europeans, assumptions about Slavs, distinctions between Western and Eastern Europe, and class coded immigrant prejudice still exists, where workers from Poland, Romania, and the Balkans may still face some stigma in parts of Western Europe, despite being racially categorized as white. So, Central Europeans occupied a middle zone of whiteness. Historically, the most accurate way to describe Central Europeans in racial hierarchy system is they are usually inside whiteness, but not always at its symbolic center, as they often occupied conditional whiteness, ethnic whiteness, peripheral whiteness, and immigrant whiteness before eventually becoming normalized within the broader white identity. So, not only does that conclude my coverage on Central Europeans, but it also concludes my coverage of the areas in Europe. So, that's one continent down, and we have several more to go. I am going to move on to Western Asia and North Africa for obvious reasons that are kind of related to race. So, we're going to break those two down despite them being in two completely different continents and not being attached to the continent of Europe. Then we'll work outwards. I don't know how long this is going to take, but I'm having a lot of fun with this. So, thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye.